Hi everyone. I welcome everyone for day two sessions, and as you already know, we have 12 plus Microsoft speakers debating at the Integrate conference, and one of them is Steve Jeffery, who has been working in Microsoft for close to 10 years now. This dedicated session for solutions in the Power Platform will be taken over by Steve to give you updates on all their cool new features. Welcome, Steve.
So good morning, everybody. I wasn't quite expecting an introduction like that, so it's quite a nice surprise. It's really strange, I've got to say, but really refreshing to be able to be back in person. So this is my first in-person event for quite some time, so it's great that we're all able to be together again. So at Microsoft, I work for what's called the Power Cat team. Now, Microsoft, a company that loves acronyms, the CAT stands for Customer Advisory Team. And Power is the Power Platform, so we're part of the engineering teams. And our job is to make what we call our managed customers successful in their investment of the Power Platform. So it means we get to work with customers in a number of different ways. Depending where the customer is, it could be helping them set up their governance and their administration, all the way through to helping review and provide advice and guidance on some of the enterprise solutions that they build. And that's something that I've been doing a lot of recently, is helping customers build enterprise-grade solutions. And that's the topic of today's session. So I don't know where we all are with the Power Platform, so I'm going to talk just for a few minutes about the Power Platform itself, just some of the basics so that we all understand the terminology. And then we're going to move into sort of some of the things for architecting solutions. Now, one of the things in my role is, we get to cover a lot of solutions, and we get to cover a lot of very complex solutions that customers try to build. And the idea of today's presentation is to kind of bring back to you the things that we find. Now, some of it might seem obvious and common sense, and some of it might be irrelevant to what you're doing, but hopefully there'll be at least something here of use for you in the future. Okay, so the Power Platform itself, as you can see, this is a brand new slide I found this morning just before our session, but it covered all of the new products really nicely. Now, the Power Platform itself is built up of a number of sort of first-class services that you can see here, or applications, each of them performing a very specific role or purpose within the platform, but with a single goal, and that is to try and make putting together solutions something that everybody can do. And I think that's what the Power Platform does really well. It provides, I'll go to the next slide. It provides a really complex, the ability to build really complex solutions. So we have the first-class applications within the Power Platform that are underpinned by the services that you see below on the bottom part of the slide. Now, I checked yesterday, and there are currently 759 connectors that you can use to connect to pretty much any one of the services here, which is pretty astounding. And if there isn't a connector amongst those 759 that you can use, you can build your own custom connectors, whether it's to your own web services or to on-premise services through the on-premise data gateway. Next up, I want to talk a little bit about AI Builder. So the AI product groups have done an outstanding job of taking a very complex and misunderstood topic and distilling it down to almost, dragging and dropping an AI-driven control into a Power App that more or less any of your customers can benefit from, whether that's from a pre-trained model or from a model that you've trained yourself. Then we have Dataverse, and Dataverse I'll be talking about quite heavily today, which is the API for the data layer underneath the Power Platform. It is a database, but it's not just a database. It's a confusing topic to kind of discuss, but it does provide you with your tables and columns and all of the kinds of things that you would expect. But it was also underpinned with a number of features, not only just an extremely granular security model. Then we have PowerFX, which is the common language across the platform, and the management tools. Now, the management tools is something that you'll see, or you may have seen, has been heavily invested in. Most recently, we introduced tenant-level analytics, So as more and more of our bigger customers come on board with the Power Platform, you're seeing the admin and governance capabilities increasing pretty rapidly. Okay, so we're just going to talk a few minutes about the different types of apps because it does bear relevance to the topic of solution architecture. So in the Power Platform currently we have Power Apps, sorry, we have two app types, the model-driven app and the Canvas app. Now the model-driven app is driven by data. So when you've got into a position that you've architected your data layer, you can start building a model-driven app based on dashboards, views, and forms. One of the strengths of the model-driven app is that the UI is kind of taken care of for you. It's responsive out of the box and it's accessible, and it really allows you to focus on more process-based use cases. So if you can imagine an employee onboarding process, something that needs to pass through specific gates before that row or that record can be closed off, then a model-driven app is where it kind of plays to its strengths. Next up is the Canvas app. Now, typically, these are not Dataverse driven. I do deal with a lot of them that are, but traditionally they're kind of underpinned by a SharePoint list. And as the name kind of implies, when you start to build a Canvas app, you start with a blank screen and that's all you've got. And it's kind of up to you as the app maker to decide how you want the user interface to look. Traditionally, these aren't typically they're not responsive. When you build a Canvas app, you usually start from a form factor, whether it's going to be optimized for desktop or the mobile. You can make them responsive. There are responsive containers and there are approaches that you can use, but that's down to you as the developer to do that. And these are traditionally focused on or ideally used in task-focused apps. So if you can imagine like a health and safety inspector app, for an example, where somebody would be walking around with a mobile device taking images of health and safety issues. That would be a good example. So why is that important? It's important because your solution will typically consist of one or many of both types of app. So it's important to understand which app has the best, which kind of scenario fits the type of app. Components. Components is something I want to quickly touch on because sadly it's not something I see enough of being used. Components within Canvas apps are really there for promoting reuse, not just in the app that you're building, but across any app that you might build in the future. So a good example is navigation. So you might have multiple screens in your app, and you need to provide some kind of way for your app users to navigate in between these screens. You'll spend time designing a navigation and then potentially copy and paste that onto the various screens within your app. So now you've got sort of 5 copies of that navigation. If you need to make a change, so maybe you need to change the color or icon or something, you need to do that to each screen, which is kind of a waste of time, really. Now, if you built that as a component in the studio, through the authoring experience, you can simply drop that component onto all of the screens, so you end up with like a parent and child kind of relationship. And if you decide you need to make a change, you just make a change in the component and it's reflected throughout all of the places that it's used in your app. So it's really useful for the app that you're working on, but also for future apps. It can sort of promote a bit of consistency for the look and feel and some of the capabilities that you need to build inside your app. The other kind of component that you'll build is a Power Apps component framework, where it's written with code. And this could be if you've got a more complex control that you need to build or something that's specific to your use case. A quick call out. So as part of the CAT team, one of the things that we focus on is working with the big customers. We get to put together lots of really cool tooling. And the idea really is that we kind of distill that and distribute it within the community. So Mehdi and Denise and our team recently built this thing called the Power Apps Creator Kit, which is a collection of components that use the Fluid framework. So it looks, if you can see on the screenshot, it kind of looks SharePoint list-ish. That's because it's using the same look and feel and controls as SharePoint does. So, I've got links at the end of this presentation for you to grab if you want to. But it's a mixture of Canvas components and code components. Okay, so the composition of your solution. The reason I've spoken about the types of apps is purely through the number of reviews that we do. We find there's either one or two cases, large monolithic apps. So what does that mean? That means you'll invest time in building a Canvas app. Let's stick to the health and safety example. So you've spent all this time building out all of the requirements for the users for the Canvas app. And then a new persona kind of comes in. Maybe you need to build in an admin experience. So what you end up doing then is trying to bolt on the admin experience to the same app. So now you've got one app for two completely different use cases. I'd try and avoid that if possible, purely because it's harder to maintain and your apps get bigger and bigger, and you can cause issues really, really easily with large apps. So I try to avoid that. Conversely, I'd try to avoid having too many small apps. One solution that a colleague of mine reviewed in the last couple of weeks had 42 apps in the solution. And when we reviewed like what they were all for and who they were for, we could have distilled that down to maybe a dozen or so. If you think about your users, they don't want to be switching between apps for the same, for different kinds of requirements. So ideally, try and keep the number of apps somewhere between large monolithic ones and too many small ones. Get it in the middle, and you've got it about right. Next up is components. I really encourage people to start using them. If you invest a bit of time now creating a navigation control that you could use throughout all of your apps so there's a consistent look and feel for your users, then you're saving time in the future, so you can spend it doing other things. So spend a bit of time and build out your own component libraries and try and make sure that all of the controls are branded as per your guidelines or whatever it is that you need to build. And then lastly, I've put in mobile apps. So this is important when you think about your users, of where they are and what they're doing when they need your app. I've seen quite a few times where someone's built a Canvas app that's optimized for the desktop because they have a mix of mobile and desktop users. And the mobile users suffer because of that, because they've not built it responsive, and the app is optimized for desktop on a mobile, which is never going to be a nice experience. Okay, let's walk through just an example, just to sort of talk through how this could apply in real life. So here we have a pretty simple solution, which is an expense claim form. So we've got 5 different users or communities of users, personas, whatever we want to call them, involved in this, starting from the top. So Lee, the salesperson, we can see that the task that they need to perform is to create an expense report. And we know that they're mobile. So we know that the user is going to be mobile. We know that they want to create an expense report. Following that, we've got the line manager to do the approval, Nick. And by the look of that, they could be desktop or mobile. Then we've got Abe, the accountant, who's going to process the payment. Now, those 3 users require access to the app in a read-write fashion. We've got Charlotte, who just wants to see a weekly budget report. So that's more of a Power BI kind of requirement than it is accessing an app. And then Rebecca, the auditor, she just needs a read-only view of the expenses that are created. So from this one slide, we can see Rebecca, she only needs read-only access. We can start thinking about the security modeling there. And then we've got Lee at the very top, who is going to be submitting the claim. So Lee is a good fit for a Canvas app because he's mobile, and we've got an optimized for mobile Canvas app where Lee can create his expense claim. Now, when I grabbed these slides, there wasn't anything for Nick, so poor old Nick. I don't know if he gets to use the model-driven app, or maybe he's notified through an adaptive card in Teams or email. There's a ton of different ways that you can manage approvals in the Power Platform. Probably, let's assume that he was sent a nice adaptive card in Teams with the claim and the ability to approve or reject it. Now, Abe, because this work is following a process, you might need to check that there's no fraud going on or anything like that. There's a process to it. It's a great fit for the model-driven app. And because we've got a single source of the truth, which is Dataverse, it's very easy for us to build and scale out this solution as more requirements come on board, whether that's from Power BI reporting or any kind of Power Automate process that needs to hang off the back of it. Okay, so just to wrap up this piece, this is quite important, and it's something, again, that I see a lot of, which is where there's an app for that. There's an app for everything is the kind of approach that we usually see. And it can be like there's one app for it and we're just going to put all of our requirements into it and make this humongous app versus I'm going to build an app for every single requirement, which we saw, which I mentioned just recently. So try to understand the users of your solution, where they are and what they need to do, and base it around the people rather than the technology behind it. Okay, so the next sort of section is really for us to walk through some of the basics around, or some of the things that we find, and the things I wanted to share with you around just general architecture. So environments. If you've done any work with the Power Platform, you'll already be aware what an environment is. If you're not, it's just a place. It's a place to store the apps and flows, the tables, the connection references, all of the things that are to do with your solution. They all live in the environment. And it's really simple to fall into the trap of just creating one and then hoping everything will work. But there are a number of things to consider that we'll go through in the following slides that are really, really important and can have a massive impact on the overall success of your solution. One of them being location, which I'll talk about in a second. And we've got admins and security groups. So often the trap with architecture is just to think about getting the solution through the door and not thinking about the ongoing maintenance and the ongoing administration of it. So understand who's going to be the environment admin is always a good one. And then think about how are you going to provide access to your users to the applications that you're building. So which security groups are you going to need to use? Are there any on-premise data sources that you're going to need access to? And in which case you need to start thinking about gateways. Think about Dataverse and licensing. How will you ensure that your users are assigned to the appropriate license to access the solution? And then the big one is actually data loss prevention policies. Usually, where I've seen this fall foul is where the solution architect will propose using connectors that might not be already approved by the organization. So it's really important to get that in front of the people that need to approve it early in the process so that you're not delayed by any kind of reviews for connectors. And then surprisingly, we've got development, test, and production environments. It seems to be that customers quite often don't consider having a development environment where they can build these solutions, deploying that through to test and production. And then obviously that tees into ALM. Now, the ALM Accelerator is another shout for the PowerCat team here, really. It's something that the team put together. It's a Canvas app that's built on top of Azure DevOps, with the idea being that you can create your own kind of automate your own pipeline. So you can export your solutions from development to test or from development to test to production. Now, the ALM story for Power Apps is something that's ongoing. There's lots of new things that will be coming. But this is a great gap filler. And this is one of the things that we kind of specialize in as the team is, working with the big customers, we get to see these gaps and we get to address it via either tooling or docs. And this is one of the things that we put together and shared. So again, there'll be links at the end of the session, but it's a really good tool for you. Okay, so the location, this one's actually really important. I put together about 7 points that I would recommend you consider. One of them is about users. I'm sure many of you work for global organizations, so trying to understand that when you provision an environment, it's bound to a geographic location. So try to think about latency in that issue, in that instance. Another thing to think about is if your organization has separate business units where they may all be using the same solution. Say you're building something for finance, you've got finance in the North America and in EMEA, and they can't see each other's data. So think about that, if that's something that you need to consider, if there are any specific or weird security requirements that you don't necessarily know about, or if there's any GDPR requirements that are in place. So try to think about these things before you start planning out your environment or environments. The next thing is to consider things that are not part of your environment, but part of your solution. So things like any Azure services, any on-premise services that you need to access, any SharePoint sites, any Teams, wherever the solution integrates that's not part of the environment, it's really important to consider that and understand how that impacts not just your development, but also your deployment. So any Azure services that you've got deployed, any Power BI workspaces or dashboards. And then security, I won't talk too much about it, but as it's obvious, but if you use a Dataverse environment, the security model for an environment changes massively. In a non-Dataverse environment, you kind of have two concepts. You have the admin and then everybody else. If you enable it for Dataverse, then you get the really granular data model, which is based on security roles. Security roles are just a collection of privileges that you've assigned to specific tables within your Dataverse instance. Again, licensing, that seems to be one that often falls foul. Think about how your users will be assigned licenses. And again, DLP. This is where things trip up more often than not. You know, you'll be proposing to use either a custom connector or one of the 759. It may have even changed overnight, but that huge number of connectors. Make sure that the people that approve it are involved early in the whole process. So working with data, I've spoken about connectors briefly, and I won't go into too much detail about them, but some of the benefits are that you can leave your data where it is. So if you're using SharePoint, there's no reason why you shouldn't, as long as you're aware of the restrictions or the limitations of using SharePoint as a data source. One of the benefits is that you can leave the data where it is. You don't need to worry about moving it anywhere. You can access information that you've got on premise through the gateways. You can create your own custom connectors if you need to. Or you can even look at things like virtual tables in Dataverse. Now, either are a good fit, and I think there's no right or wrong way of deciding which way you're going to go, whether you could use a SharePoint connector or you could create a virtual table for SharePoint. It's entirely up to you, but it's important that you understand the limitations of both approaches. And as long as you understand that and you're aware of it up front, then I think you're setting yourself up for success. We find quite often with solutions that tend to use SharePoint, there's not much thought into how much data is going to be generated over a period of time. So maybe in a year, your good idea has now turned out to be a really bad one because you've got thousands and thousands of rows and the app is now performing really slowly. So try to think of, if you're architecting it in that way, architect it to exit, if that makes sense, so to migrate away from SharePoint when you reach that point. But just be aware of the limitations, and I've put some of the limitations in for virtual tables, so things like search, offline, and auditing are not available. Custom logic is another one. So deciding where to position your logic. Especially with Canvas apps, there's always a tendency to lean to write as much code as you possibly can and to do everything in the app. And that's not always the best way to do it. A lot of the time if you think of a good example, actually, I reviewed an app a couple of weeks ago where they wanted the user to be able to override an hourly cost if they needed to. And they'd written all this logic in the Power App to do it, where they could have done it simply with a business rule in Dataverse. So it's using the right tools for the right job. It could have saved them 30, 40 lines of code, which, all right, it's not a lot, but it's doing it in the right place. That Dataverse could have done it without having to worry about any of that. And then the on-premise data gateway. So this, again, many of our large customers still have a really large on-premise estate that they need to integrate with. And this is where a lot of the time we see issues with solutions where the gateway is always the problem. So I've put, in the next couple of slides, I've put just a collection of the kind of common things that we run into. And a lot of it is obvious. So things like, don't install the gateway on just a single server, because that's a single point of failure for a big enterprise application. Build a cluster instead. Try to make sure that cluster is on the same network as the resources that you're trying to access. And in some regards, try to keep the latency as low as possible. So one side of that, if you think about the latency between the gateway and your on-premise resource, you can work with your network teams to reduce the latency as much as possible. The other side of it might be slightly trickier, right? You might have to involve your ISP or look at Express Route or something like that to try and keep the latency between your gateway and the cloud as low as possible as well, because you will be introducing latency. Think about maintaining this. So updates are released monthly, and if you need to raise a support ticket, I think the last 6 months updates will be supported. So think about how you're going to update these gateways and make that part of your ongoing process for your app and your solution. And then have a plan. This is really important actually. So make sure that you have somewhere a document that contains your gateway recovery keys. Otherwise you can't add or remove nodes from the cluster. Very obvious, just as much like don't have a single server. I feel a bit cheeky standing here telling you that, but we do run into it a lot. Try to separate your workloads. So don't just build one cluster, because a great example of this was where a customer had a gateway cluster and other people were using it without telling them. So they had all of this traffic going through this cluster that they knew nothing about, and they're scratching their heads. They've sized everything appropriately. They have multiple servers. They've done all of the right things, but other people have kind of seen it and jumped on the bandwagon, as it were, and they're using it, and things are falling down. So have multiple gateway clusters. Ensure that they're sized appropriately and monitor them to make sure that they are working as they should. And then scale up, i.e. add more resources, or scale out, add more nodes, as and when you need to. Analytics. So analytics is incredibly important, and it's a really valuable tool. I talk about this a lot with customers. Out of the box, you get pretty good analytics information. It gives you how many users they are, whereabouts in the world they're accessing your app from, how long they're spending inside your app, etc. But if you really want to go to the next level, this is for Canvas apps, by the way, then use application insights. Not only out of the box do you get a ton of really useful information, but you also get the ability to write your own custom trace events. And that's really, really important, because you can capture your own error messages. You can track the popularity or the success of some of the features that you're releasing. So if you think about, in Office, we used to, I don't know if you still get it, but the little smiley, sad face icons, you can use it to write trace events to see if people are happy with the new features that you're releasing, etc. So it's really useful from a performance perspective to have a view of all of this. In model-driven apps, you can also use application insights at the Dataverse layer, so you can filter it to capture events for your model-driven app, or you can look at using the performance insights, which is a preview feature that allows you to view the critical events for your model-driven app over a period of time. So again, giving you that insight, which is critical to making sure that things are performing as you expected them to. Optimizing solutions. So one of the things that we do as part of our solution architecture review is when the customers built the app, they give us a copy of it and we run it through some tooling, which you can download. I've got a link to it in the presentation. And this tooling, which I'll cover off in a few minutes, runs like a number of checks for best practices and worst practices, I guess, is the other option. I'm not sure what they're called. And it comes out with a report. And the common things we find are kind of summarized on this slide. So in the image, you've got kind of a fictional call to a number of tables. And you can see at the top, they're happening sequentially. So one is completing, then the next one runs, and so on and so forth until it's finished. Just using a simple approach of using concurrency, so they all happen at the same time, can speed things up massively. The next thing we always recommend is to defer your data calls. Now, again, this is really about Canvas apps, but in a Canvas app, you have this thing called the on-start event, which is one of the execution phases that an app needs to pass through before you see the app load on your screen. And there's a temptation to go off and get all of the data that you could ever possibly need before the user even gets to see the app, because then the theory is that it'll be faster for the user, or a better experience when the user's in the app. But you're forgetting that the user's now going to wait 60 seconds before the app's loaded. So try to defer these data calls, calling only the data that you need at the time that the app loads. So try to avoid unnecessary data calls and minimize your API calls. And again, I'm going to call out telemetry data. Use it as much as you possibly can to try and ensure that your app is performing the way that you expected it to. There's a performance monitor in the Maker experience as well, which can help you understand where the bottlenecks are in your application, because there probably will be. Then also look to offload the work from the app. So if you're building really advanced logic, is it a better fit to build a Power Automate Cloudflow and then just call that from your app? Think about offloading it or using business rules or Azure functions. And then again, it's really important to understand the connector infrastructure. So understand how calls are made and the journey that they have to take in order to return information. So here we've got a good example of a call to a SharePoint list, and this could be a button click, it could be anything. Just imagine that we are going to a SharePoint list and looking up a record. So from the second that event is triggered, the OData request is formulated, it's passed through the API management layer, through the connector and down to SharePoint. Then SharePoint has to do its thing, and that's something we have no control over. We don't know how long that's going to take to complete. And then when it has, it comes all the way back to us. Now, understanding that and understanding the complexity of what you're writing is really important. In this example, we're adding in the on-premises data gateway. So here, we're making a call down to an on-premises SQL server. So again, the OData request is formulated, passed through the API management layer, the connector, and then the data gateway, where the data gateway has to convert that OData query into something that SQL will understand. SQL again needs to do its thing, which again, you should have control over, I'd like to think at least, because it's on-premise. And then the journey comes the traffic comes all the way back. But understanding this is pretty key. And then the Dataverse example, we don't have an API management layer or anything or a connector or anything to go through because it's fully integrated into the platform. So the round trip is far less. Now the code review tool, this is something I've kind of mentioned several times. It's something that you can download. It's once you've installed it into your environment, you can pass in an MS app file, and that app file will run through a series of checks, and it will check for the patterns that we come across most frequently and provide a report for you to give like a score of and advice and guidance around how to address the things that you find. So I'd use that as well as the telemetry data and the performance monitor to try and ensure that your app is working as well as it possibly can. Then we've got common performance issues. So I've spoken about this a little bit. There are some that you can do things about. So calling lots of data. Try to defer that and ensure that the data is where it needs to be when it needs to be there. So don't just call everything at when the app is launching. It does slow things down massively. Try to avoid complex code in your on-start event as well. That is that is something that will slow the app down. Too many columns returned is another good one, especially if you think about SharePoint. So by default, you might look up one record, or you might filter a SharePoint list based on the status. So for example, show me all of the tasks that are in progress. Now, SharePoint will send everything back, all of the internal metadata, all of the columns that list has. So you could end up with 50, 60 columns of data, and all you wanted was maybe the ID of the SharePoint list item and the status. So ask for the information that you want returned. There's obviously more code to write, but it's a more efficient way of doing things. The next one is slightly harder, but it's the location of user versus the location of the environment. So as I mentioned right at the beginning of this section, it's important to understand where your users are, what devices they're using, because if you're in the field with a mobile device, you've got a really bad signal, and your environment's in a completely different region, then you're not going to have the best experience as a user. And cross-screen dependencies is another one that we run into, where a control in one screen will be waiting on the status or expecting something from a completely different screen. That is very difficult to troubleshoot, and it is also possibly a performance killer, because if something hasn't completed on another screen, then it's not going to have finished. Right, we're nearly done. Okay, so to summarize, we started off talking about the composition of solutions, so understanding the different kinds of apps that there are and their strengths, play to their strengths and use them. Try to avoid cumbersome apps and try to avoid having too many apps as well. There's a sweet spot somewhere in the middle. Use components. And I'll keep saying it, use components, use components. They save you time in any future app that you're going to build. If you spend a bit of time building component libraries now, your apps will be consistent and much faster to develop because you've already built everything or many of the controls that you're ever going to need. Think about the performance. So as you're building your app, think about calling the data that you need, not just grabbing everything. So spend a bit of time, invest a bit of time in calling the columns that you need from your data source. Understand the data sources that you're using. So if you're using Dataverse, think about its strengths, think about business rules, think about calculated columns and roll-up columns. Use all of the features that you can in the platform so that your app becomes lighter and so that you don't have so much logic or so much code to write. Think about the location of your data, again, to do with your environment or maybe even to do with your on-premises SQL server if that's what you're connecting to. But try to think about the location of your data and try to use concurrency wherever you can. Using that consistently throughout an app will increase the performance of it, dozens of times over. We spoke briefly about the importance of analytics. So you obviously have the performance monitor inside the Maker Studio. So use that, test it often to ensure that you're addressing any bottlenecks, you're spotting them as they appear, and then do something about it. Then you've got the app insights. So again, especially for Canvas apps, you can write your own custom trace events. So if you're trying to track the popularity of a feature, you can build custom trace events in and around those buttons or that part of the app, or you can use it for writing out custom errors. There's out-of-the-box analytics, so do explore that. Those are things that are improving all of the time. As I mentioned, most recently there's tenant-level analytics that have been released. So there's a lot of work in that space. So don't just jump on App Insights straight away. We spoke about data. So the on-premise data gateway being one that possibly many of your customers or yourselves will have to interact with at some point if your organization or your customer's organization has on-premise data sources that you need to interact with. Try to ensure that it's sized appropriately and it's scaled appropriately, and make sure that monitoring is in place to ensure that you can react to things that you might not have been aware of. So things like end-of-month reports. Anything that's going to be a sudden surge on the application, try to make sure that you're aware of it and that you're monitoring it and that the gateway can handle it. I'll try to I'll share later. There's an article around sizing and it's really in depth. I should have put that on here. We spoke briefly about connectors. So the power are that you can leave the data where it is. There are 759 of them. I can't even imagine that if I'm honest. But I guess there's still a need to write custom connectors if you've got your own services that you want to connect to. And there's virtual tables. But when you're deciding any of this, just make sure that you're aware of the limitations of each, because there are limitations with all of them. Then we spoke about environments. So the importance of understanding from a DLP perspective, again, if your solution is using any connector that's not part of your DLP policies, make sure that the people that approve it are involved early in your architecture process so that you're not held up further down the line. And the same goes with any security group. So when you get to architecting your security, make sure that all of the requests for groups and things are submitted to whoever needs to actually do that work. Because this is where I often see delays in either development or testing, is because of these two things where groups haven't been created or DLP hasn't been approved. Think about the location of your users to try and ensure that, and do what you can about latency. I mean, there's only so much you can do. If they're mobile, then you're not going to be able to necessarily influence the quality of the signal or wherever it is that they're working, depending on what they're doing. And then some takeaways, some takeaway thoughts. So the top part of this is really just about platform architecture roll-up. So understand that the components are designed to work together. Don't don't try and use or play to their strengths rather than focusing on their weaknesses, because there will be gaps. There are always going to be gaps in the product, but new features are being released all of the time. If you do spot a gap, look to Azure or something like that to fill it, rather than push the product to the point of breaking, because that way it's easier for you to wait for a new feature to be released and backfill it with something rather than trying to push the platform beyond its capabilities. Common sense again, but avoid using unsupported techniques. If you're not sure, raise a ticket and we'll tell you if it's supported or not. There's nothing worse than you investing a lot of time in something to find out that it's unsupported, and we're restricted with how much we can help you. I had a really good example of that with a customer last year, where they invested a lot of effort building their own return to work app just as we all started going back into the office. And it was performing in a really random, weird way, because the way that they'd approached it was all unsupported. And we helped them as much as we could, but at the end of the day, they had to re-architect a big chunk of their application because of the way that they'd approached it. So if you're not sure, raise a ticket and we can help you figure that out. Consider the performance impact. So again, as I've mentioned, thinking about data calls, get the data that you need, not just allow it to return everything. Consider using things like concurrency, deferring data calls. Just be smart with how the data is coming into your app or being sent back to your app. And then understand and monitor. So understand what is on the product roadmap. That's it's always kept up to date. You'll see what's planned, what's in development, what's being released and when. And then it's up to you to kind of come up with a strategy to decide when you're going to use these new features or new approaches. Try to ensure that you're not using deprecated features. You don't want to be using something that's ripped out of the product and then find there's a big hole that you now need to try and fill. And then again, avoid using unsupported customization. So do raise a support ticket. That's what they're there for. It's easier for you to do that. Ask us a simple question. I'm planning on doing A, B, and C. Is that supported? Yes or no? It's simple. It will save you tons of work in the future. Now, I'll find a way to share the slide deck with everybody after this session. I've put in some links to the PowerCat team's things that we've built. So things like, we've built things like the COE starter kit, if you've ever heard of it. We've built the creator kit, the ALM accelerator. There's a ton of tooling and docs that we generate as a team. So I've tried to put some links into that if it's useful to you. And with that, I think I'm about done. I don't know if I'm on time or early or what, but that's it from me. And if you do have any questions at all, it's my email address, please do feel to ping me. I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. So thank you.
Covey.co